Petersburg Battlefields Foundation in collaboration with Petersburg National Battlefield, hosted a History at Sunset tour of the Battle of Jones Farm on Saturday evening, June 29. The tour was presented by Tim Talbott of the Central Virginia Battlefields Trust. Here is the story and tour of the Battle of Jones Farm that took place on March 25, 1865 on the preserved properties of the American Battlefield Trust, 6476 Church Road, Petersburg, Virginia.
The National Park Service, but if you're not involved already, this is my public service announcement, if you're not already involved with the Battlefield Preservation Organization, whether that's the American Battlefield Trust, the Petersburg Battlefield Foundation, Shenandoah Battlefield Foundation, or the Central Virginia Battlefield Trust that I work for, I encourage you to do so. These acres are quickly slipping out of our hands, and this is one of our last ways that we're able to keep contact with those men who fought on these fields 160 years ago, is to preserve this land. So if you're not already involved, give them a little something, at least a membership. That helps keep the lights on, helps keep the mail going and the word out to everybody. My name is Tim Talbott. I'm the Chief Administrative Officer for the Central Virginia Battlefields Trust, but for about 10 years, over 2 different time periods, I worked at Pamplin Historical Park next door. So I got to know the Battle of Jones Farm and the Petersburg Campaign pretty well in those 10 years that I worked here, and it's great to be back in Southside Virginia. Sometimes we don't fully acknowledge the importance of these lesser known battles, but as hopefully you'll find out today, these battles are really important because they impacted larger events, and as you're going to see on a couple examples I share at the very end, they impacted these men's lives very, very much, and I'll tell you through a couple of their stories. So to help set some context, we'll go way back a little bit. December 20th, 1860, South Carolina, no, we're not going to go that far back. Let's go back to May 5th, 1864. There's going to be a series of battles known as the Overland Campaign that are going to last for about a month and be very, very costly in casualties for both sides. But Grant's going to make a tremendous amount of gain in that month's worth of time. He's basically going to cover about 100 miles from the Rapidan River down to the James in that month's worth of time. And there's going to be, of course, a lot of casualties, as I mentioned, about 55,000 casualties estimated for the Union forces, about 35,000 for Lee's army as well. The problem with this Overland Campaign, although it's creating tremendous amount of casualties, it's not creating any decisive situations that's going to turn the war one way or another. Now, I'm not going to go through the 9 offensives of the Petersburg Campaign either to save some time this evening, but I'm going to give you a few highlights to get you thinking in the right direction. Now, historians have broken down the Petersburg Campaign, those 292 days, and what we're going to be talking about is the 284th day, March 25th, 1865, so we're right at the last end. Historians have broken the Petersburg Campaign down into 9 offensives, and after the 4th offensive, which is in mid-August of 1864, Lee is really kind of starting to get hemmed in. Grant has taken 3 major railroads by this point, as well as 1 main wagon road. But the Confederates still have the Boyd and Plank Road, which is off to our left, Highway 1 now. And then also they have the Southside Railroad, which comes west from Lynchburg as well, bringing them supplies that they need. And of course, the railroad between Richmond and Petersburg is still open as well at this point. As Grant has contracted Lee's ability to bring supplies in, he has extended his own, but also protected it. The United States Military Railroad, which in my personal opinion is the whole key to this campaign, along with a supply base at City Point, is going to be bringing men, going to be bringing supplies for that 23 mile trip from City Point out to Patrick Station, which is just south of us, about 3 miles. It's going to be huge in this battle, but to protect that supply line, the Federals are building earthworks on both sides of it to make sure that it doesn't get raided and stays in good shape. There are some changes in command as well during the first several offensives, right up to where we're talking about. In the 9th Corps, the campaign had started out with General Ambrose Burnside in command of it. After the 3rd offensive in early August, he's out, and General John Parke is in charge of the 9th Corps of the Army of the Potomac. Also, at the end, beginning of November, or in November, General Hancock is not going to be leading the Second Corps anymore. You know, the Second Corps had always been the stalwart throughout the Overland Campaign and the early fighting in the Petersburg Campaign, but Hancock is out and Andrew Humphreys is going to be leading the Second Corps after November of 1864. Now, during the winter of 1864, this landscape is going to change dramatically from what you see here today. The soldiers, the Union forces, are going to be camped behind us in a series of forts, which run basically all the way around Petersburg to the south end, ending at Fort Welch. The Confederates are in earthworks just behind you all. The main earthworks meant to protect the Boyd and Plank Road and the South Side Railroad. And the soldiers that are in these camps are totally denuding this area for wood. They're building winter quarters. They need wood to cook their food with. They need wood to serve as fuel to stay warm in the winter months. So this landscape, one soldier said, was as barren as a desert in some spots. So this looks really different. And what we think soldiers could see at this time is much different than what we can see today because of these trees. But they would not have been largely here at that time. Well, at this point in the war, in, let's say, late February, Lee is in a real pickle. He is being asked to cover 37 miles, basically almost 40 miles of earthworks, all the way from White Oak Swamp east of Richmond down here to Hatcher's Run. 37 miles with a limited number of forces. This is Grant's plan, of course. He wants to stretch Lee out as far as manpower, thinner and thinner, cutting these supply lines as he goes. And hopefully, eventually, he thinks that Lee will be stretched so thin he'll eventually break somewhere. Just as if you pull a rubber band far enough and put some pressure on it, it's going to snap. And Grant's plan's working. It's very slow over these 284 days, as we said. But he's also worried a little bit too. He's worried Lee is going to leave these defenses and move somewhere south. Maybe join up with Joseph Johnston, continue the war, hopefully. Hopefully not for Grant's perspective, but for Lee, hopefully extend the war. But Grant tells us, he says, one of the most anxious periods of my experience during the rebellion was the last weeks before Petersburg. I felt that the situation of the Confederate Army was such that they would try to make an escape at the earliest practicable moment. And I was afraid every morning that I would wake up from my sleep and hear that Lee had gone and that nothing was left but a picket line. I knew he could move much more rapidly than I could, and that if he got a start, he would leave me behind so that we would have the same army to fight again further south, and the war might be prolonged another year. Well, at this particular time, Grant was actually planning his next offensive, the 8th offensive. And that's going to play out in a series of battles that you guys are probably familiar with. The Battle of Lewis Farm is going to happen on March 29th. 4 days after this battle, we're going to be focusing on the Battle of White Oak Road is going to happen on March 31st. And then the Battle of Five Forks on April 1st. Most of these battles are being fought, these three, by the 5th Corps, which is kind of in reserve on March 25th. And of course with Sheridan's cavalry as well thrown in for an extra measure with Five Forks. But it wouldn't be until the 8th offensive, until Grant finally cuts the Boyd and Plank Road. Now Lee's under pressure to do something, and he gets a message from General Joseph Johnston from down in North Carolina on March 23rd, which is 2 days before this battle, by, I guess, telegraph or messenger. And he says to, Johnston says to Lee, quote, "Sherman's course cannot be hindered by my small force. I can do no more than annoy him. I respectfully suggest that it is no longer a question of whether you leave your present location. You only have to decide where to meet Sherman." So he's in a tough situation. He's getting pressure from Johnston to do something. And that's probably his best option of his few options, is to, if he can, get to Johnston, join forces, fight Sherman, who has come up through Georgia into South Carolina, into North Carolina, defeat Sherman, if they can, with combined forces, and then come back up here and tangle with Grant. Looking back in hindsight, it looks like a forlorn hope, but they don't have a whole lot of options here at this point. But Lee decides to strike first. Now, some people have called Lee audacity personified. He'd got this reputation of the offensive, especially early in the war. Places like the 7 Days, the flank attack at 2nd Manassas, the flank attack at Chancellorsville. He had got this reputation of doing the unexpected. And he is going to do this again on March 25th. He had solicited information from his youngest corps commander, John Brown Gordon, on where Gordon thought the best place might be to attack the Federals here at Petersburg. What Gordon comes back with to Lee is the best place to attack is where the lines are closest together. And that's over at Fort Stedman, east of Petersburg, near where the crater is, not too far from the crater. Here the lines are very close together. As a matter of fact, the pickets are only about 50 yards apart. And Lee thinks that if he can breach that position and threaten the United States Military Railroad, that really important link that's running supplies from City Point out here to these soldiers on this western front, if he can attack and capture or even cut or hold for a little while that military railroad, that would force Grant to pull these Federal troops out of this position to the south of Petersburg and leave him an avenue to go into North Carolina. Now again, to us looking back in hindsight, that's probably a long chance, but again, not a whole lot of options here for Lee. Now, Gordon's attacks are successful. The morning March 25th over at Fort Stedman, he does capture the fort briefly, but Union forces are able to send in reinforcements, and then also using the artillery in surrounding forts, push the Confederates back out of Fort Stedman, and they regain control. Now, that's the 9th Corps over there under General Park. It's also going to result in about 2,000 Confederate prisoners being captured at Fort Stedman. That's 2,000 men that Lee cannot afford to not have. He's going to need those men, but they're going to be out of commission for the rest of the war. Now, we know that at this point, the war's only got about 2 weeks left until Appomattox, but they obviously don't know that at this time. Now, we're here on ground zero of Jones Farm, and you may be asking yourself, first of all, who is Jones and what did he farm? This ground that we're on actually is going to be fought over 3 times. It's not too rare in the Petersburg Campaign to find ground that's fought over twice. That happens like at Ream Station, several other places, but it's hard to find a place in Petersburg Campaign fought over 3 times. But this ground was first fought over at the end of September, early October, known as the Battle of Peebles Farm. The Federals pushed as far as up to the Jones house before they finally retreated back to build the earthworks that they're going to be attacking from in this fight. And then on March 25th, the battle we're focused on, and then again on April 2nd, as I mentioned, 8 days later, as they attacked the Confederate defenses here as well. So this twice fought over ground, 3 times fought over ground. But back to Robert Jones. The 1860 census tells us that he was a 50-year-old planter. A decade before, in 1850, he's listed in the census as a tobacco inspector. He owned about $57,800 in real estate, which if you do a little bit of estimating, that's about $1.6 million today. That included 1,020 acres of land. He grew wheat, oats, rye, corn, and of course tobacco. His agricultural census tells us he owned horses, mules, cattle, and 200 hogs. He also had $100,000 in personal property, which is about $2.8 million today. So if you combine his real estate property with his personal property, it's about $4.5 million. This guy's pretty wealthy. He enslaved 74 individuals ranging in age from 70 to 1 year old, and they lived in 17 slave quarters here on the property. Now he's got a lot of connections. If you've ever been over to Pamplin Park and heard about the Boysaw family, got a lot of connections with the Boysaw family who owned Tudor Hall over on Duncan Road. He's going to marry 2 of the Boysaw daughters. Wait a minute, 2? Well, the first one died at a relatively young age in 1840, so he married her sister. First wife was Martha, second wife was Anne. He married Anne about 1850. Now, the matriarch of Tudor Hall, Athalia Boysaw, her and her husband had started Tudor Hall Plantation in 1810. Athalia is actually going to be living with Robert Jones and her daughter here at the Jones house in the 1860 census, along with their nephew, Adrian, whose parents had moved to Alabama in the 1850s but had died from disease. Of course, another Boysaw is going to own property that we might be able to see approximately where he was, Albert Boysaw, which was Joseph Boysaw's brother, as well as John Pegram. Now, Albert Boysaw and John Pegram are going to lose their houses in the People's Farm fighting back in October. Their houses both are going to be burned because sharpshooters are using them as protection. There's a famous woodcut, and I know you guys aren't gonna be able to see this. There's a famous woodcut that printed in Harper's Weekly, I'll just pass it around, showing the Pegram house, well, what's left of it, and then the earthworks that are being built at Fort Welch, which is again behind us. Get another point for questions. Any questions at this point? Yes, sir.
Is the Pegram that you're speaking of any relation to Willie Pegram?
I believe he is a distant cousin. Now this woodcut says the rebel Colonel Pegram, but that's incorrect. But I believe the families are connected relation-wise, because Willie Pegram and John Pegram, their father was from Petersburg area. Any other questions? All right. So we'll walk and make a brief stop on our walk, because I want to show you where the earthwork line, excuse me, the picket line for the Confederates originally ran. Now after they lose this position, they're going to fall back and build another picket line behind you guys, probably about 400 yards from the main earthwork line, about halfway between us and the main line after they get pushed back. But I'll show you along the way where that line ran, and then we'll try to find some more shade up the road here and talk more about the engagement itself. All right. On my right, it's hard to see with the leaves being on, but this is a mound of dirt, and this was the Confederate picket line that ran from across Church Road over here. Now these were just basically what they called rifle pits. You can think of basically an improvised kind of foxhole as a modern term. But it's basically a pit where 3 or 4, maybe even up to 5 guys are going to be in one place with some dirt thrown out in front from the hole that they dug. And it's going to run these pits every about 20, 25 yards apart from each other. And they're going to run over across into that woods where we'll see them again. These that were in this area have been tilled under because of farming agriculture, but they basically run right across where that wayside sign is across the way there, and then all on the way around the field, sort of curving as they parallel basically that main Confederate earthwork line. But what the Federals do is once they capture these earthworks, they entrench them. They strengthen them and they reverse them, pointing toward now the Confederates. They've been pointed this way toward the Federals, but when the Federals capture them, they reverse them and strengthen them into basically an entrenched line pointed that way. So that's what you see off here to the side. Again, kind of tough to see this time of year, but that's what's over here. Where the Albert Boysaw House stood before it was burned. There's a lot of seesaw fighting here in the Battle of Peebles Farm between the Union and Confederates. A lot of flank maneuvers going on. There's several Federal regiments that get captured in whole here. One of the most famous captives is the brother of Walt Whitman, who's fighting in the 51st New York. Captain, I guess still a captain at that point, Captain George Washington Whitman. But a lot of people ignore this Peebles Farm fighting here. It gets overshadowed by the offensive before it and after it, but this is really important for that 5th offensive fighting. And of course, I won't get into that. I'll try to stay on time. So to help us with our positions of the Union troops on the Western Front here, the 2nd Corps, which I said is in charge, or is being led by Andrew Humphreys, is south of Arthur's Swamp. Now Arthur's Swamp, if you've ever been to Pamplin, kind of runs right through the middle of the park. So south of that, facing west, is Andrew Humphreys in the 2nd Corps. And he's facing Henry Heath's Confederate division. And that is composed of 4 brigades. You've got John R. Cook, William McCrae, William Macomb, and Joseph Davis. And these are mainly North Carolina, Tennessee, and Mississippi troops. Then the 6th Corps, which we're mainly going to focus on here, is north of Arthur's Swamp, facing west as well as north, against Cadmus Marcellus, great one of those Roman name, classical names, Cadmus Marcellus Wilcox Division. Now at this time, James Lane is leading the division because Wilcox is sick. Now in addition to Wilcox being sick, A.P. Hill is sick. So actually, I guess James Lane is actually leading the whole corps at this point. This composed of James Lane's North Carolinians, Samuel McGowan's South Carolinians, Edward Thomas's Georgians, and Alfred Scales North Carolinians, but Scales is also sick or wounded. He's recovering from some of his old wounds, and it's being led by Colonel Joseph Hyman. So that sort of gives you the situation here. Second Corps is down there. They're going to be fighting on April 25th too, and they're actually going to lose more casualties in their fight with Heath's men than the 6th Corps that we're focused on here today, but we're going to worry about that. Now the 6th Corps had just returned to Petersburg back in December. They had been here early in the Petersburg Campaign, but in June, they're going to get pretty roughed up in the second offensive, trying to capture the Weldon Railroad. A lot of their soldiers are going to be captured by attacks from William Mahone, as well as, drawing a blank here, Jerry, Wilcox, on the 22nd, 23rd of June, 1864. They had also gone, after that, been sent to Northern Virginia and Maryland, trying to fight Jubal Early in his movement to threaten Washington, and then they'd stayed in the Shenandoah Valley through the fall of 1864. And when they came back here to Petersburg in December of 1864, they're going to man the earthwork line that runs basically from the Weldon Railroad over here to the far federal fort, Fort Gregg. So basically from Fort Wadsworth to Fort Gregg is the 6th Corps. It's being led by a gentleman named Horatio Wright. And when Wright learns about Gordon's breakthrough at Fort Stedman, he actually releases one of his divisions under Frank Wheaton to go. It's the easternmost division, the closest to Fort Stedman, so he's going to dispatch them to go over and help if need be. That's about 7 a.m. on the morning of the 25th. That left Wright, the 6th Corps, with 2 divisions, George Washington Getty's division, as well as Truman Seymour's division. Now, Seymour's an interesting guy. There's a lot of well-traveled people in the Civil War, but I don't know if anybody's more well-traveled, as an officer at least, than Truman Seymour. He was at Fort Sumter. He was with the Army of the Potomac in 1862. He gets sent to the Department of the South, so he's at Battery Wagner. He's at Olustee down in Florida. Comes back to the Army of the Potomac in 1864, is captured at the Wilderness. He's in the Shenandoah Valley. He's here at Petersburg. He's everywhere. But he's leading one of the divisions in the 6th Corps. Now, Wright reasoned that if the Confederates were attacking at Fort Stedman, the earthworks in front of him were probably stripped from some men to send over to Fort Stedman. And Wright was right. What's funny is he shows a lot of caution knowing that information, or at least suspecting that information. So Lane's brigade had been sent to Fort Stedman, and 2 of Edward Thomas's regiments in his brigade had also been sent to Fort Stedman. They make it all the way over there, but they're not going to be engaged. They arrive too late, and when they find out that Fort Stedman has fallen back into Union hands, they start making their way back over here. But they're less, a brigade and a half basically here. So what Wright does is he telegraphs headquarters at City Point, and he reaches General John Parke of the 9th Corps. Where the heck's Meade? He's in the James River on a boat. President Lincoln decided to make a visit to City Point, and Grant had invited Meade to come over and visit. So there's several big brass at City Point instead of out here in the field, where they probably should have been, but you don't turn them down the president. So Wright telegraphs Parke of the 9th Corps, who's kind of leading things while Meade's out of communication. He says, as the enemy must have massed on the right of our line, meaning at Fort Stedman, they must have left their own line weak. How would it do for us to attack along the whole length of our line? And about at 8:30 a.m., learning that Fort Stedman was back in Union hands, Grant responds back from City Point. He says, through Meade, the general commanding, meaning Grant, wishes you to determine whether or not the enemy is in strength on his old line. Your pickets are to drive him to their works, and in case these works are not held in force, your Pleasant line will be abandoned and your troops will all be available. General Griffin's division of the 5th Corps is halted at the White House to support you. So although he has dispatched General Wheaton with his division from the 6th Corps, he has a backup in General Griffin's division if he needs it. So if anything, he should be emboldened to make this stroke because he's got a lot of people behind him. But Wright turns cautious, and at 9:40, Wright reports back that the situation on this front has not changed, which is not true. Well, he probably doesn't know that a brigade and a half have left. He says, shall the skirmish line advance under these circumstances? Now again, this is not Meade or Grant answering, this is Meade's Chief of Staff, Alexander Webb, responds, yes, drive in their pickets. General Wheaton is ordered to report to you again. So he's on his way back from Fort Stedman. However, Wright didn't either receive this report or he ignored it. Now finally, at about 10:50 a.m., Wright wires Meade. Quote, not hearing from you and learning the picket line of the 2nd Corps is ready, I shall push forward at once. Now, of course, this delay in time has allowed Thomas's 2 regiments to come back, has allowed Lane's regiments in his brigade to come back from Fort Stedman. This whole March 25th is just a mess of communication, command, and control issues for the Union Army. It's a wonder they do as well as they do. And most of this is, of course, because of Lincoln's visit, throwing a wrench into everything. Now, Meade did not immediately receive these wires because after he got off the boat, he got on a train and was on the military railroad coming to his headquarters over near Poplar Grove Church, where his headquarters was. So that sort of sets us to that point. Any questions?
How far away from here is Stedman?
So from here to Stedman, as a crow flies, I'm going to guess is about 5 or 6 miles, something like that, to the east.
What are the numbers on each side? Essentially, it sounds like you've got a corps against a division, and at that point, it's got to be a weak division for the Confederates. What are the numbers?
So those figures are not going to change a whole lot, except for the Confederates are going to lose a lot of soldiers captured on March 25th. But when the Federals attack at the breakthrough, 8 days later, they've got 14,000 men. They're not going to lose a whole lot of troops here on April 25th. So they've got roughly, we'll say, 13,500. And the Confederates have probably, with a whole division, I would guess close to 4,000 guys, something like that. That'd be a rough guess. Any other questions? All right, we're gonna go back to the trail and then we're gonna make a left and try to find some more shade over next to the wood line. This is really going to be sort of a half-hearted attempt here, to be honest with you. He's going to send forward the Federal picket line, which would probably run somewhere midway out in this field between here and the tree line that's behind us, far behind us. He's going to send the skirmish line with 230 men from the 10th Vermont and 160 men from the 14th New Jersey, basically in a long straight line, skirmish line, about 5 yards apart from each other, moving forward. Both of these regiments are from General William True's brigade of Seymour's division of the 6th Corps. This is only 400 men. It's kind of half-hearted, attacking a very strong Confederate picket line. Now, to back them up, they're also going to put in the 110th and the 122nd Ohio from Colonel J. Warren Keifer's brigade. And they are sort of serving as ranked troops behind the picket line as support. And this is the ranked troops are going to be led by Colonel Otto Binkley of the 110th, and the skirmish line is being led by Colonel George Damon of the 10th Vermont. The ranked troops are going to be lined up about 100 yards behind the skirmishers, and the skirmishers are about 300 yards away from the Confederate picket line. And this is about 12 noon. Colonel Damon and the skirmishers are going to move forward with, they were said to move forward with a shout at the double quick, but they were quickly met by very strong fire from these Confederate pickets, and then also from artillery on the main line. Remember, they can see these guys coming because the trees are gone at that time. So they're going to take pretty heavy fires. They're making their way across here, and they really slow because especially the 122nd, doesn't have a whole lot of experience. They're pretty green troops. Colonel Binkley's men are going to be moving up right behind them, but all these guys are basically going to be forced back due to the heavy fire from these Confederate pickets. One sharpshooter for the Confederates, a pretty well famous guy, he wrote a memoir after the war named Barry Benson. He was in the 1st South Carolina. If you've not read his memoir, I highly recommend it. Very interesting guy. He left an account of this. He said, quote, "First we saw coming marching from their breastworks a line of the enemy's infantry winding down slowly along the little ravines and gullies until they reached open ground that stretched for some distance in front of our picket line. There they formed a line, deployed as skirmishers, and advanced to the attack. Pretty soon our pickets opened fire on them. They fired in return. As the interval between the two grew less, the sputtering of rifles grew rapid until the whole line within rifle reach was taking part in the fight. With a run and a cheer, the enemy closed up and seemed determined to take the works, meaning the rifle pits. But the fire of our pickets was too heavy, and after a moment's hesitation, the attackers broke and fled. But they soon rallied, stood out in the open field where they could see it, still out in the open field where we could see it all as in a picture. They waited, received reinforcements, meaning those ranked troops. Again, they were met by a fierce fire from our pickets, and again they rushed forward with a shout and charge, and again they broke in disorder and fled, leaving their dead and wounded." Now this piecemeal attack, remember they're attacking from basically Fort Welch and Fort Fisher, moving this direction, is going to take about an hour. So they're having to cover about 3/4 of a mile of ground. It's going to take about an hour for them to do that before they break and start rushing back. At about 1:15 p.m., Wright telegraphs General Warren, not going to meet again, he's going to Warren, another Corps commander, the 5th Corps, that his advance had failed. And again, this shows Wright really being cautious. He says, "The enemy is strong in my front, and I think I may fail." Nothing like positive thinking. "I shall try, however, and hope to be ready within an hour for the main assault." I don't know that he ever planned on there being another assault after this one failed, or when this one failed, but he comes up with having a main assault. Now Meade had started back, as I mentioned, by train from City Point, and he stops first at Meade Station, which is over near Fort Stedman, and then he continues on to the 6th Corps action here. Now, as I mentioned, President Lincoln is here. He doesn't stay at City Point. He actually comes out here to the Western Front, presumably on the military railroad. And not only is it President Lincoln, his wife, Mrs. Grant, and some other entourage are with him as well. They were supposed to be reviewing the 2nd Corps troops, but the 2nd Corps, as I mentioned, is engaged south of Hatcher's Run with the Confederates in Heath's division. So they get Crawford's division from the 5th Corps to do a review for the president. A New York Herald reporter who is on scene, and this is all happening at Fort Duchesne, just south of Fort Wadsworth, quote, "He," meaning Lincoln, "was not afraid to show himself among them," meaning the soldiers, "and willing to share their dangers here, as often, far away, he had shared their joys and triumphs. Mrs. Lincoln and Mrs. Grant, with other ladies, were of the reviewing party, whose presence also showed, if the word is allowable in this connection, a manly courage. Subsequently, the ladies and their masculine escort, all aglow with glittering stars and buttons, and whom General Warren now joined himself, went to Fort Wadsworth nearby, for which could be seen our own 6th Corps and the enemy pickets exchange battle shots." So Lincoln comes from Fort Duchesne to Fort Wadsworth with his entourage and watches them fight this battle. It's only about 1.5 miles away. Again, being denuded, they can see over here. So watching at Fort Wadsworth, Horace Porter from Grant's staff writes in his recollections, quote, "The president carried a map with him, which he took out of his pocket and examined several times. He had the exact location of the troops marked on it and exhibited a singularly accurate knowledge of the various positions." So Lincoln has been thrown in here to watch his men fight. So at about 2 p.m., General Wright convenes a meeting of his chiefs. So there's Wheaton, his division commanders, Getty, Seymour, but there's also some brigade commanders. Lewis Grant, who's in charge of the Vermont Brigade. If you want to follow a great brigade of fighters throughout the Civil War is the Vermont Brigade. Check them out. And then some others as well, brigade commanders. He assigned the main assault to General Keifer, his division of Keifer's brigade of Seymour's division. And he's going to lead them coming out of Fort Fisher, which, if you know, Fort Fisher, it's on the east side of Church Road. He's going to be coming up that way. And this is where your map's going to come in handy to talk through the rest of this. So attacking in Keifer's brigade is the 9th New York Heavy Artillery, of course fighting as infantry at this point in the war. You've got the 6th Maryland, the 126th Ohio, and the 67th Pennsylvania. Again, some of these troops are relatively new, especially like the 126th Ohio. Colonel Cornwin of the 122nd Ohio, part of those troops that went with the skirmishers in that first limited attack, he said, quote, "It being the first time the greater part of the regiment had ever been under fire, they were somewhat confused for the moment, as the enemy had a very strong picket line and my regiment had to advance under a severe fire of musketry from the enemy." Again, Barry Benson gives a real good report of this second attack. He says, quote, "Soon they formed, not a line of skirmishers as before, but a solid line of battle. On they came, shoulder to shoulder, the stars and stripes flying over their heads. Again, the rifle fire broke from our rifle pits, extending to the right and left till the whole line, as far as rifles could reach, was cracking and sputtering. But forward still swept the line of blue, heeding neither their dead nor their wounded. Forward still, with a rush and a shout, the flag well to the front, and our hearts sink with fear that they will go over the works," meaning the rifle pits, "at the first charge. But no, they have stopped. They stand still and fire and reload and fire. Our men kneeling in the pits take good aim, and we can see how busy they are. It is but a minute before the enemy's line falters, appears about to break and flee, but look, the color bearer runs forward alone with his flag with a shout that rings again. The blue line follows in a swift charge through the deadliest fire. They reach the works and turning rapidly to the right and the left, they sweep along the line in both directions for a long distance, taking possession of a half mile of rifle pits." Now, Keifer's brigade is going to claim the capture of about 200 Confederates in their first attack here on the rifle pits. Well, who is this flag bearer that rallies the guys? Historians have narrowed it down to two different flag bearers. One, Robert Spence of, where's Mike? Of the 6th Maryland. His colonel said, quote, "Being the first man in the works and planted our starry banner thereon, shortly after which he was wounded in the neck by a bullet from the enemy." Another possibility is Sergeant William Rager of the 67th Pennsylvania. His officer commended him, quote, "He carried the national colors and made himself conspicuous in this engagement. The flagstaff was shot off close to his left hand and 22 balls passed through the colors, but the sergeant planted his flag on the light works," meaning the rifle pits. Now, if Keifer's is not enough, they're going to take some more rifle pits. Attacking next to Keifer is going to be Getty's division. That's composed of the brigades of Lewis Grant, the Vermonters, Thomas Hyde, and James Warner. And they're going to be basically straddling Church Road as they move north. So they're also on the east side of Church Road as well as on the east side, pushing forward. They're going to meet very little resistance as they move up, and they're going to go all the way to the Jones House. They're at the corner where Hofheimer is today, basically, and they're going to capture a number of Confederate pickets on their way. Colonel Hyde is also going to attack along with Getty's division. And Hyde had just recently been promoted, so he was a little worried how he would perform. He said, quote, "It was not a question of danger at all, for in great responsibility, personal danger is little thought of by anyone. What is to be dreaded, not doing the right thing at the right time." So as they move forward, of course, they're going to be extending their lines, and they're going to basically expose their right flank to artillery fire from Battery 45 and from Fort Gregg. And it's going to really rake these guys pretty hard on the Union right end of the line. Lieutenant Colonel Augusta Dwight of the 122nd New York and Hyde's Brigade is going to be decapitated by a shell as he attempted to try to wheel his men to meet those Confederate artillery. Another shell is going to hit into a rifle pit where there's 3 Union soldiers, officers huddled, and Hyde is going to watch a severed foot and boot fly over his head. And its victim was one of his officers who he had denied a furlough to just a few days before. Warner's advance is going to be stopped by General Thomas's Georgia Brigade. Now remember, 2 of his regiments had gone over to Fort Stedman, had returned. They had actually stood on top of their winter quarters, watching that first piecemeal attack by the skirmishers in the 110th and 122nd Ohio. They're standing on top of their winter quarter roofs watching this attack, but they see the next attack comes is much stronger. They get off their cabins and join the fight, and they try to flank these units that are on the right end of the Union line. Mainly the 45th and 49th Georgia, about 400 men, are going to try to blunt Grant's, Warner's, and Hyde's advantages. Captain John Hardiman of the 45th Georgia recalled, "Our line was good, our yell frightful, our fire murderous, and our victory complete." He thought he'd had it won. The enemy in confusion fled, falling at every step. Now, again, Grant's Vermonters are going to get up to the Jones house. They're going to be forced back from the Jones house by heavy Confederate fire, mainly from the main earthwork line, and South Carolina's sharpshooters under Major Dunlop. Another great memoir. If you've not read Dunlop's memoir, I highly recommend that. He says that his men were firing from about 250 yards away, just making every shot count. He said, quote, "The Federal artillery played upon our lines, but with little effect." So the artillery is firing from all these Union forts and along the curtain in between them. Save the destruction of a few of our shanties, meaning our winter quarters, and the explosion of an ammunition chest, which killed 2 men and wounded 3 others. There was little effect other than that. When they get up to the Jones house, Colonel Hyde is going to get raked by a shot on his coat. And that's about enough for him. He says, "We're going to burn this down." It's being used as a protection for the sharpshooters. So he tries to get some guys to fire the house. And again, Barry Benson leaves account of this. The Jones house was known as Oak Grove, the plantation here. And it was described by a lot of people as a comfortable residence, meaning a nice home. I believe it was brick. And Benson says, quote, "The Jones house was a large residence which had stood to the rear of our picket line, but now that the enemy had taken our rifle pits, the house lay between the 2 advanced lines of foes. It was getting dark when we saw some figures moving stealthily about the house. We opened fire, but were unable to drive them away. Presently, a bright flame shot up, then another. In a few minutes, the house was one large flame of fire, lighting up the fields for a great distance around." Again, the Confederate artillery is going to be firing on these Federals. We really don't know what they're doing right now or where to go. And one of McGowan's staff officers, John Fitzjohn Caldwell, who wrote the history of McGowan's brigade partly in Tudor Hall House over at Pamplin Park, he said, quote, "Thomas's men had their line almost at right angles with our breastworks. The enemy, in order to front them, formed their line at right angles with us. This, of course, enabled our artillery to completely enfilade them. So the enemy fought at great disadvantage, receiving the whole fire of an almost equal force of infantry in front and the shells of our artillery in the flank." So they're in a bad position. But one of these regiments, the 1st Maine, is going to break off and charge Thomas's Georgians basically by themselves and check him. So that removes one of the problems. Captain Hardiman again, "The hill was blue as far as we could see, both to the right and the left. Our 2 regiments, numbering in all about 400 guns, fought them until they were within 50 yards of the front of our works. They had nearly surrounded us. Our ammunition about this time completely expended. Colonel Simmons gave the orders to fall back. We knew if we escaped it, it would be a miracle, but we thought we would try it. Some did not hear the command and remained in the rifle pit and gave the Yankees the benefit of the butts of their guns. Those that remained were captured." Wheaton's division, now back from Fort Stedman, is going to join in the attack as well. So if it already wasn't enough Union forces attacking here, you're going to add some more in, and Wheaton's division is going to attack and capture about 200 more Confederate picket line soldiers. So there's an important piece of high ground on the line called McElwain Hill, and the Federal forces are going to push far enough to capture McElwain Hill during this fighting. Major Dunlop of the Confederate sharpshooters said, hour after hour the conflict raged back and forth across the consecrated hilltop until the mantle of darkness interposed and closed the contest, leaving the crest in possession of the enemy, meaning the Federals. Some of the soldiers in Edwards' brigade of the 6th Corps are armed with Spencer rifles, the 37th Massachusetts, and I believe the 5th Wisconsin as well. And they're going to be using those to great effect on the Confederates as the sun's starting to go down here late in the day. So by darkness, the Confederate line of rifle pits are in Union hands. And Colonel Elijah Hunt Rhodes, which you guys are probably familiar with from Ken Burns's documentary series, 2nd Rhode Island, he said, quote, immediately we sent for entrenching tools, and turning the enemy's works, we soon connected the line with our main works to the rear, meaning this direction. So they've got these lines turned facing the Confederates, and what we're going to do is walk up the trail here to the woods, and you can see some of these earthworks that have been reversed by the Federals facing the Confederates to get a better idea of what this looks like. But you can see behind me, this is the original Confederate. There were picket rifle pits along through here that were facing this direction, and then once the Federals captured them, they turned this again into a longer line, and this section has survived here because they left this particular piece of the farm wooded, maybe as a way of at least keeping some of these intact. But you can see the line that runs through here, and it went across again the road, but went all the way out into the field and went all the way down as well to Hatcher's Run. So this line ran a good 3 miles this direction from where we're at now, ultimately, these rifle pits. And when they got pushed out of here, they had to fall back. And they went back probably about 400 yards behind us. And if you go over on the edge of the Pamplin Park property and the ABT property right on the line, you'll continue to see these pockets of where they fell back on March 25th and redug in. Sometimes they're trench looking, sometimes they're more pit looking, but they're in really good condition over there on Pamplin Park property where these rifle pits are. If you go along the battlefield trail, the long loop, really well preserved. So as in most battles, casualties are kind of hard to figure, especially at this point in the war where things are moving really fastly toward the end. The 6th Corps reports that they lost 47 men killed in this battle, 402 wounded, and 30 missing for a total of 479. The Confederates don't give an accurate count of their casualties here at Jones Farm, but for the whole fighting on March 25th, historians have estimated that between the fighting at Fort Stedman, down at Hatcher's Run with the 2nd Corps and Heath's division, as well as here at Jones Farm, the Confederate casualties are about 4,000. And the vast majority of that 4,000, of course, are prisoners of war. 2,000 captured at Fort Stedman alone, probably another 800 captured here, and more down there. So the vast majority of the Confederate casualties, like it's going to be on April 2nd, are prisoners of war. With the day's fighting over, of course, the fighting was done, but not completely. It had been a really, as you might imagine, from my explanation of things, a very dizzying day. One of the best explanations is given by Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Lyman, who served on Meade's staff. When he talked about May 25th, he said, quote, "We may indeed call this a many-sided field day, a breakfast with a pleasure party," meaning the president and his entourage, an assault and recapture of an entrenched line, meaning Fort Stedman, a review by the president of a division of infantry, and a sharp fight at sundry points along a mile of 18 miles, meaning all the way from Hatcher's Run to Fort Stedman. If this was not a mixed affair, I would like to know what is. It has been a lucky day for us. Thought it was very fortunate. So on March 26th, the Confederates really worried about that McElwain Hill. They thought if Federals kept on McElwain Hill, they would be able to use that high ground to enfilade the main Confederate earthwork line with artillery. So what they do is plan a almost special ops mission. 400 sharpshooters from McGowan's, Lane's, Scales, and Thomas's brigade are going to each be promised, if they survive this attempt, a 30-day furlough to go home. So this gets underway on the morning of March 27th at about 5 a.m. They immediately caught the Union pickets of the Vermont Brigade as well as Thomas Hyde's brigade off guard, and pretty easily capture McElwain Hill back. And they're going to hold it through April 2nd. One of the soldiers in the Vermont Brigade is none other than the hero of the breakthrough, Charles Gould, who is usually credited as being the first man over the earthworks on April 2nd at the breakthrough. He said, quote, "We had a general row for a short time, and I was in command of our brigade picket. I had my hands full for a while." He's probably understating that. Gould's going to report 38 men wounded and missing. Again, most of those taking prisoner, but McElwain Hill is now back in Confederate hands. Now, as we talked earlier, Grant's going to shift his focus of attention to the southwest with attacks at Lewis Farm, where Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is going to be wounded again. And to counter that, Lee is going to send McGowan, South Carolina Brigade 5 regiments from this position down to White Oak Road. So what was already a thinly held Confederate earthwork line with basically 3 regiments, 3 brigades, is now down to 2. You've got Lane's and you've got Thomas's Georgians trying to defend this position, basically 2,800 Confederates. So as you can tell, that's not going to be very good against this Union attack on the morning of April 2nd with 14,000 soldiers. Well, sort of the so what of this. So what? Why are we out here sweating? Finding out about such a small battle that really in the grand scheme of things maybe seems like not much. Well, the people that were here understood the very importance of this battle. Colonel Hazard Stevens, who served on General Wright's staff of 6th Corps commander, said, "The advanced positions thus gained on March 25th were of incalculable advantage. From them, all the intervening ground to the enemy's line could be closely scanned, as well as his works themselves, and room was afforded to form an attacking column in front of our works and within striking distance of the enemy line." So now, instead of being, way back here, they're up on this Confederate picket line. They can see weaknesses in the Confederate earthwork lines, particularly Arthur's Swamp, an avenue of attack where there's not really strong defenses of the earthwork line. General Humphreys of the 2nd Corps said after observation showed that the selection for the point of the attack, meaning on April 2nd, was the best that could have been made. The parapets had high relief, the deep ditches, preceded by 2 lines of abattis, well constructed with a fray in between them, meaning those pointed sticks. Every few hundred yards were batteries, well supplied with artillery. But for the capture of the enemy's entrenched picket line on 25th of March, the attack of April 2nd could not have succeeded. So this is really important, this fighting on March 25th. Gives them the picket line, they can see weaknesses, they know how to form up. They've attacked in this column formation before, the 6th Corps. They'd done it at Rappahannock Station. They had done it at Spotsylvania on May 10th when Colonel Emory Upton leads an attack that breaks through but gets pushed back. They know how to attack in this column formation that they're going to attack in on April 2nd, but this time they're going to make it succeed, and they're going to shatter that Confederate line. By capturing the Confederate picket line and now being only 800 yards away, the 6th Corps could get a closer look at the main Confederate earthwork line and determine where to mass their troops for the ultimate breakthrough punch on April 2nd. So I'm going to end, those of you that know me probably know that I really relish the common soldier stories. So I'm going to finish up with 2 common soldier stories. The first one is from Sergeant Major Marion Hill Fitzpatrick of the 45th Georgia. He was in Edward Thomas's brigade. Now, he was about 25 years old when the war started. He had just got married in 1860, had his first child in 1861, and he was one of those, what you might call reluctant Confederates. He didn't sign up until right before conscription was supposed to kick in the spring of 1862. But when he became a soldier, he became a soldier. And if you only read one collection of letters of Civil War soldiers in your life, read his collection of letters called Letters to Amanda. It's published by Mercer University Press, and it's a fantastic look into the life of a common soldier in the Army of Northern Virginia. But Marion Hill Fitzpatrick was not here on March 25th, 1865. He was sick and he missed this battle. 3 days later, he writes back to his wife. He says, quote, "While I was gone, the regiment got into a severe fight. It was on the 25th, and like to have all got killed and captured. Ed Jordan, Jim Drew, Lieutenant Walker, Tip Hammock, Tom Rickerson, Lucius George, Henry Saunders, Bill Seymour, Henry Pope, Henry Gibson, Frank Knight, and a fellow named Minus, a recruit from Alabama, were all captured from Company K. Henry Knight and Noah Cloud both severely wounded. Knight had his left leg amputated. The loss of the regiment is 6 killed, 25 wounded, and 118 captured. None were killed in Company K that they know of. Lieutenant Colonel Kahn was killed and Major Gibson captured. All is quiet now again, but it is sad and sickening to look at our regiment now. It seems that Providence ordained that I should miss it, or else I might not now have been captured, or else I might have been captured or killed." Well, in the fighting on April 2nd, defending the main Confederate earthwork line, Marion Hill Fitzpatrick is going to be mortally wounded with a leg wound, probably put on the last train from Petersburg to Richmond. He gets to Manchester, just on the southern side of Richmond, stays in a private house to try to recover, and passes away, some say on the 4th, some say on the 6th, not really sure, but he passes away. So although he wasn't here, this battle dramatically influenced his life. The other soldier I'd like to tell you about, a Union soldier, is Private Judson Spofford, Company K, 10th Vermont Infantry. He was only 16 years old when he enlisted. In July of 1862, he was one of the 300,000 that Lincoln called for to join up in the summer of 1862. Now, following Gettysburg, the 10th Vermont ended up being placed in the 3rd Corps. And then when the Army reorganized in the spring of 1864, the 10th Vermont ended up in the 6th Corps. They saw some really hard fighting. The Overland Campaign, the Valley in 64, and then here around Petersburg as well. When you look at Private Spofford's service records, every one of his muster cards say present for duty. 16-year-old enlistee, by this point he's what? 19 probably. Heck of a soldier. But during this fight, he is going to be hit, as you can see, in the the right chest. This picture shows. The ball is going to go through both of his lungs, and it's going to lodge under his left armpit. He's going to lay on the field for several hours, unattended. Finally, he's going to be taken to a field hospital, probably at Poplar Grove, and the doctors refused to treat him because the triage of the day said, if you're shot through the body, you expected to die. Let's work on some people we can probably help. So he's laid outside. He finally convinces somebody to take him inside the tent where it's warm. And then he convinces somebody to take a look at him. The doctors cut the bullet out from underneath his arm, and then they run a ribbon through his lungs to try to clear the stuff out. He coughs up some of his uniform from his lungs. Well, he gets transferred to Lincoln Hospital in Washington, D.C., and then to a Vermont hospital. And believe it or not, probably due to his youth, he is going to recover. He eventually moves to Idaho, and he lived there until he dies at 91 years old in 1937. So March 25th also definitely had a strong impression, no pun intended, on Private Spofford. I want to thank you guys for your time and your attention coming out tonight to learn about these men and this otherwise seemingly unimportant battle. But hopefully maybe you're looking at it a little bit different way. I appreciate you all coming out and doing that, supporting battlefield preservation. Thank you.
Special thanks to Tim Talbott for presenting our history at sunset tour of the Battle of Jones Farm that took place on March 25, 1865. Please visit our website at petebattlefields.org for information on tours, events, and to donate. Be sure to subscribe for more videos.